Today is July 25th, 2014. This is Larry Petit. We're here to interview Arthur R. Carmody, Jr. as part of the Shreveport Bar Association's Historical Perspective Archives Committee project, and also the Louisiana Bar Foundation's interviewing of important, significant lawyers and the project they have ongoing. Today, Mr. Carmody, we're going to ask you to share a little bit about your practice of law, your background, and your history. Are you ready to roll?
Good morning, Mr. Petit. Ready to roll. Fire away.
Tell us first, when and where were you born?
Larry, I was born in Shreveport on February the 19th, 1928, at what was called in those days Shreveport Memorial Hospital. Or I'm sorry, Shreveport Memorial Sanitarium.
And your parents?
They were Arthur R. Carmody and Caroline Goins. My father came to Shreveport as a boy in 1910 or thereabouts, lived here all of his life, graduated from Notre Dame, and was in the oil business for all of his active life.
I'm going to show you a picture that hangs in your wall and ask you if you could hold it and get a little. That is indeed the hospital, is it not?
This is the Shreveport Memorial Hospital where I was born in 1928. This picture was made in 1920, which was about the time that the hospital was made to replace an old frame building that was out on Texas Avenue at the time.
When did the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word start running the hospital?
Around 1910.
If you could show that picture to the camera. Tell us also, when did you start representing the Sisters and Shreveport?
This firm started representing the Sisters in Shreveport at the time that Dr. T.E. Shreveport, who the hospital is named after, donated his old hospital on Texas Avenue to the Sisters. And they took over the operation of it and were able to handle the move to Margaret Place, where that building is located, and get started with that. And the firm represented the Sisters and Dr. Shreveport at that time and continued to do so until around 1990.
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
Do I have?
Yes.
I have 2 brothers and 1 sister.
Are you the only lawyer in the family?
I am the only lawyer in the immediate family, although my grandfather, T.J. Goins, was a significant lawyer and judge in Camden, Arkansas.
Your mother's side of the family then was from Arkansas?
That's correct, Larry.
Tell us a little bit then about your educational background. High school, where'd you go?
Well, in those days, you went from the 7th grade direct to high school. And I went direct from the 7th grade to St. John's High School, which was a Jesuit high school here in Shreveport, and entered what was then called the freshman class. And I went through 3 years at St. John's, and after finishing my sophomore year there, World War II had come along, and for various reasons, a lot related to the war and to my affinity for horses, believe it or not, I enrolled in the New Mexico Military Institute, where I stayed for 4 years and did the junior and senior years in high school there and the first 2 years in college.
Right now, you hanging on your wall is a very nice picture of yourself, and you're an alumni status at Emeritus from the New Mexico Military Institute, are you not?
I believe that's correct, yes.
And the horses that were part of the training, I guess the military training at that time, was it just a cavalry-based training?
Yes, that was the only 100% horse cavalry military school in the United States at that time.
And I know that after you left the New Mexico Military Institute, there were reunions not too long ago that you would go and participate in, was it trail rides?
Yes, they have and still have an annual trail ride over various parts of New Mexico, the land of enchantment for alumni who wish to sign up and ride in it. And I did that for not every year, but for most of the years, for about 15 years, from 1985 to 1998.
And those were several days out, correct?
Yeah, those were 4 or 5 days out, and one of the better trail rides I participated in. Judge Eldon Fallon from New Orleans was my guest, and he was an active and interested rider in the trail ride and a delightful companion to have. And I consider Judge Fallon one of the leading federal judges in the country.
And moving forward, from there you went to Fordham?
I went to Fordham University in New York after I finished at New Mexico, and probably the reasons were because it was a Jesuit college, and I had been well and favorably indoctrinated by the Jesuits at St. John's High School, and my mother convinced me that there were some advantages to me being polished up by the bright lights of New York, which had gone astray in the plains of New Mexico. And anyway, I went to Fordham for 3 happy years up there, and graduated in 1949.
Right. Now, you may have become interested in card playing before you got there, but as I recall, there was some pretty significant card playing going on at Fordham University.
Well, I'm not sure how you remember that or what we were talking about, but I did with my partner Tom Bonino, a lawyer in Weehawken, New Jersey. We did win the intramural bridge championship up at Fordham one year, and I thought we were both, and Tom thinks so too, we were both pretty good card players at that time. Poker games and gin rummy games probably should remain anonymous.
But I do want to move forward, and we'll come back to your educational background, but I had heard about the card tournaments that were here in Shreveport for many years. I think the Petroleum Club was one of the venues, and you were a winner for many years running, were you not?
That's what they tell me. That's what David Klotz, the late David Klotz, one of the significant lawyers here in Shreveport, who always put on the gin rummy tournament at the Shreveport Petroleum Club, in between arranging his calendar around the LSU football schedule. I think that I won it 5 or 6 years, most of them in a row.
I do remember one time we were in a deposition and we took a brief recess to allow you to go over because the next opponent that you were to face only had a window of time, and you went and played the game, won the game, came back and finished the deposition. So that's
happy memories.
That's why that sticks in my mind. After Fordham University, what did you do as far as your education?
Well, I need to go back a little bit because in the summer of 1948, I think I really decided that I wanted to try to become a lawyer. And that came about in this way. I really did not think I knew any lawyers in Shreveport or law firms, and asked my father, in effect, if he dealt with lawyers, and he said not much, but he mentioned a lawyer and law firm that I'll not appropriate to mention by name as they're still in existence. And I went to talk to the senior partner in that firm and told him I would like to work that summer, the summer of 1948, and do whatever they wanted me to do, mainly I thought running errands and so forth. And he was very polite to me, but he said that he had never heard of any job like that being available in Shreveport, and he didn't think he could help me. And so I moved on, and I was dating a girl named Margaret Wilkinson at that time, and she was the daughter of Scott Wilkinson, who was then the senior partner at the firm of Wilkinson, Lewis and Wilkinson. And so I thought I might as well go ahead and ask Mr. Wilkinson for a job. So I waited until I could come down to their office in the Slattery building, ask him for a job, and told him I would do just about anything they needed me to do. And he had just come back from World War II and was very thoughtful and polite to me, I thought. And he offered me a job. I'm not sure it had a name, but it probably would have been called office boy in those days, at $20 a week.
Where was that?
That was on the 15th floor of the Slattery building here in Shreveport, the summer of 1948.
All right, hold on. I'm going to show you a picture. And ask you if you could. see it, and then I'm going to turn it to the camera. I'm going to ask you to...
Sure, I've got it.
All right, let's get this on camera.
That picture, reading from left to right, on the left is Charles Huffman Lewis, and in the center is John Dallas Wilkinson, who was the senior member and founder of this law firm, and on his left is his son, W. Scott Wilkinson, who I've just referred to. This picture was made in or about 1925 of the 3 senior members and managing partners of the firm of Wilkinson, Lewis, and Wilkinson. And Mr. Wilkinson Sr., John Dallas, died in 1929, the year after I was born, and Mr. Scott Wilkinson and Huffman Lewis really ran and managed this law firm until they both died. Mr. Lewis died in the 1960s, and Scott lived until 1985.
So the history of this firm, is this the oldest firm in Shreveport?
They say that it is. It was founded in 1895.
Continuous till today.
And it's operated continuously at one address or another until today, right.
And again, I'll get back to your educational background, but the annual event that you have here in the firm it's a Christmas party that you invite judges and lawyers and clients and other people in the community. How many years ongoing has the Christmas party been a tradition here at this firm?
Well, we have a record or memories of it going on every year in one fashion or another since the beginning, 1896, 1897. So that's something like almost 120 years from that time until today, I believe.
Now, after you went and was office boy, office runner, whatever the term might have been back then, did you start getting an interest in actually apply to law school?
Yes, I definitely did, because my job mostly consisted of several things, filing things in the courthouse. That would include the courthouses in Benton and in Mansfield on a fairly regular basis, and getting to know my way around those places, and liked the people that I met. And reading descriptions, you'll have to remember that in those days most of the law practice in Shreveport was centered on oil and gas matters, and legal descriptions of land were a big thing. There were no Xerox machines or computers, obviously, and the secretaries would have to type the descriptions on the typewriter. It was very important that they got it right. And they always needed someone to read the description and check it over with them and see if there were any mistakes. So I did quite a bit of that. Not one of my favorite jobs, but that was another part of it. Also, I kept up the library, and we have a very significant, complete, nice library here, and I've always liked books. And I continued that when I got in law school at LSU and worked for Kate Wallace down there, who taught what was called legal bib and was in charge of the library, and enjoyed my time in the library there at LSU.
When did you start at LSU Law School, if you recall?
I recall exactly. It was in the summer of 1949.
And if you can tell me, who was the dean, or who was kind of running the academic part of the law school when you were there?
Well, in those days, it seemed to be shared between Dean Paul Hebert and Dean Henry George McMahon. Looking back on it, I understand that was during a time period when Dean Hebert, who had been the dean of the law school, and he made occasional leaps to the private practice of law with downtown law firms in Baton Rouge, that he had made one of those leaps and left Dean McMahon in charge of the law school during the actual years when I was there most of the time.
When did you graduate from law school?
In May of 1952.
And after graduation, did you enter the private practice?
Yes, I had stayed with this law firm as a runner, or whatever you want to call it, in the summers of 1949, 50, and 51. So I had 3 or 4 years around here and knew that I liked it and knew that I thought that I liked the practice of law, and they had offered me a job, and I was very glad to accept it. So this is, in a way, it's the only job I've ever had in my life.
Where were you office then? Was it still the Slattery building?
We were in the 15th floor of the Slattery building, and I had what was called I did have a corner office, which I didn't realize that was a sign of something good, apparently in these days, and I had a corner office on the southwest corner of the Slattery building, out of which I could watch the window of the Texas Eastern building being built, and the Fairmont Apartments. I remember that.
Fairmont Apartments is still with us. Texas Eastern building would be the Arcla Gas building now, on the corner of Milam and I guess that's McNeil.
Yes, it may be Arcla Gas or it may be Centerpoint now. I'm not sure.
Across from the courthouse.
Across from the courthouse.
And I believe one time I asked you, there was a building that not everybody remembers. M. Levy was at the bottom of it, and I think it was called the Riku Brewster building.
That's correct. It was at the corner of Milam Street and Marshall.
And they were raising chickens on the roof?
They were raising chickens. Mr. Riku raised his chickens on the roof in a chicken coop with a wire fence around it. And at various times you could hear them crowing. Because remember, all the windows were up in those days because of the heat.
No air conditioning.
And no air conditioning anywhere.
Now I want to know, as far as just the legal community, what judges do you recall? Let's start with the federal judge or judges at that time.
When I started practicing law, the federal judges here in Shreveport, the federal judges in the Western District were just two. That was Judge Ben Dawkins Sr. and Judge Gaston Portery from Opelousas, who were the only two judges in the Western District. And Ben Dawkins Sr. was stationed here in Shreveport, and Judge Portery, largely as I understand it, covered Opelousas, Lafayette, and Lake Charles.
Where was the federal courthouse in Judge Dawkins Sr.'s chambers?
It was in the post office building, which is now the Shreveport Public Library, on the corner of Texas Street and Marshall Street.
The federal judge Ben Dawkins Sr. Was succeeded by his son?
Absolutely, correct.
All right, and Judge Ben Dawkins Jr., who was the federal judge then for many years here, and also the Monroe Division, as I recall, was somebody that you had a good and very close professional and personal relationship with.
Yes, I was a great admirer of Judge Dawkins, and it came about this way, Larry. When I started practicing law, I lived on Maryland Avenue in Shreveport, and Judge Dawkins lived in the same neighborhood on Baltimore Street. And John Madison, Sr., who was a member of this law firm, he lived on, I've forgotten if it was either Maryland or Baltimore, but he lived in the same neighborhood. And Clarence Yancey, who was a significant lawyer with the Cook, Clark, and Egan law firm, he lived on, I believe it was McCormick Street, roughly in the same neighborhood. And those three lawyers, Madison, Dawkins, and Yancey, drove to work every day. And they were kind enough to invite me to ride to work with them because John Madison and I were going to the same place. And Ben Dawkins was in the Blanchard firm at that time, and Clarence Yancey was in the Cook firm at that time, and they were all going within a block of each other in downtown Shreveport. After a while, they found out that I could drive, and I drove them to work, since that seems to be the easiest thing to do in a old DeSoto four-door black sedan automobile that somehow they had acquired, and that was our mode of transportation. And to go in a little bit, I enjoyed and learned and prospered from the conversation of these three, I consider the top lawyers in Shreveport at the time, and well remember the first inclination or insistence of whoever on Judge Dawkins to apply to the president and the administration at the time for the open judgeship in Shreveport, which had been created by the death of his father several years before. It had been vacant ever since then. And
Yeah.
it was a very interesting conversation from which I learned, I think, quite a bit.
Now, tell me a little bit about your contemporaries who either were law classmates or came into the practice here in Shreveport, that names that you can remember and members of the bar back in around the 1952 time period.
Well, one of the most significant and successful lawyers in our class, he was from Shreveport too, although he always practiced and still does in New Orleans, was Gene Lafitte. Gene is a highly able and successful lawyer, a fine person, was a member of the American College of Trial Lawyers and the president of that organization, and has been with Let's Go and Lewis in New Orleans his entire practice, as I understand it. From Shreveport in our class, there were Joe Lesage was probably although Joe was from Homer, he came to Shreveport early on and practiced law for a long time with the Booth Lockard and Jack firm here in Shreveport. In addition to that, Sam Smith and Frank Cook, both now deceased, were members of our class. And David Klotz, who came here to work for United Gas, and I've mentioned a little bit earlier, came up from Napoleonville. David was a member of our class, although he always said that Robert Pascal made him repeat some courses, and he was really a member of the class of 1953. But anyway, David was with us for a long time before he died several years ago. And Charles C. Buddy Gray from Minden was a fine member of our class and a very dear friend of mine. And he practiced here with Harry Nelson for a while and later went to Dallas, where he did well over there.
Now, did the firm, your firm, Wilkinson, Lewis and Wilkinson, did they move from the Slattery building?
Yes, their first office was in the Wells Fargo building, which was down on the riverfront in Shreveport. And Eric Brock in his book said it was on the second floor of one of the buildings which was owned or almost owned the Batch here on the riverfront. And I've never seen a picture of it, but anyway, that's where they were until the old commercial bank building, also called the United Mercantile building, was built on Texas Avenue, which is a white two-story building where your office was at one time when
Yes.
you started out, which is still a very handsome-looking building today. And the firm was there from 1910 or so until the Slattery building was built in 1926, and the firm then moved to the 15th floor of the Slattery building, where it was when I came along in 1948.
And then was the next move here to the Beck building?
And then the next move was to the Beck building. Probably I should mention, in the interest of accuracy, that there was a hiatus of about 10 months between moving out of the Slattery building and moving into the Beck building, when we temporarily located across the street from United Gas Corporation, who was the largest client of the law firm and a very significant client back in those days, and we moved into an office in the Commercial National Bank, four-story branch office on Fairfield Avenue, right across the street from United Gas. And we were there for about 10 months. And the only thing I remember mostly about that was it was difficult to leave in the allotted hour and managed to find a decent place to have lunch, whereas we were used to being downtown and you could run to at least a dozen places and get a quick lunch back in those days when we were in the Slattery building.
Now, what you're talking about, the building 509 Market Street today is still standing and in existence, and the Slattery building is still, although the Slattery building is vacant at the time, as we speak, it's still up.
Right.
And the building you're talking about on Fairfield, which is now across the street from the State building, is still there.
That's correct.
All still there.
That's
so
correct.
when you talk about, in the Cotton Bowl restaurant might be the other one that's in that line right now on Fairfield that you could easily get a plate lunch for or a convenient time. But downtown, just real quick, what type of places were there downtown? Because we don't know the bustle and the, I guess, concentration of people that were down here in the time period you're talking about, because that's not true today.
Well, the two premier restaurants in downtown Shreveport in those days and for a long time, both before and after, were Dehan's Restaurant on Malham Street and the Columbia Restaurant on Market Street. And they were certainly upscale, white-collar restaurants. And if you were on an expense account or had someone you were trying to impress, those were the two places to take them. If you were just hanging out with lawyers, everybody paying their own way, the places to go were Morrison's Cafeteria on Texas Avenue, and both of the downtown drugstores, Rexall and Walgreens, had nice lunch counters where it was customary to go get a sandwich and a milkshake or something for lunch. You could do that quickly and cheaply, and they were very popular. And there was also a place called the Glass Hat, which for whatever reason I really never did patronize, but I'm told that it was also a popular place for lawyers to get a drink and have lunch. Also, it was on Texas Avenue.
I want to ask you a little bit about the clients of the firm. You've mentioned it a little bit, but when you, in your time practicing with Wilkes, Lewis, Wilkerson, and now Wilson, Carmody, and Gillum, the client base was United Gas, transmission companies that were here in Shreveport at the time was big business. That, of course, started slowly slipping away, I think mostly to Houston, correct?
Correct.
But you continued to do work with Shreveport Hospital, and I wanted to show one other picture, and with the railroads. And I want you to talk a little bit then about, I'm going to show you the railroad station, which again is no longer other than just a concrete base in the memory of some people. You could hold that up. Is that Union Station?
That's the Union Passenger Depot, or Union Station, built in 1925, and this picture was made at that time, which was the home of most, but not all, of the passenger trains which served Shreveport until they discontinued the passenger business in 1969.
Now, your firm has represented KCS, correct?
That's correct. We've represented the KCS and had a long and happy relationship with them from 1898, when they came into Shreveport and Caddo Parish, until the present time.
You would take passenger rail cars out of this station and go to Kansas City for business?
On a fairly regular basis, right.
And at that time, they had Pullman or sleep cars, right?
I'm sorry.
Pullman, sleep. In other words, you would sometimes go overnight.
Yes, it was an overnight trip to Kansas City. And from Kansas City to Shreveport was also an overnight trip.
Dining car?
There were on the typical freight train, on the typical passenger train of those days, were the engine units. There was the baggage car. There were coaches, or also called day coaches. There was a dining car. There was a Pullman, or maybe two Pullmans, and there was a lounge car at the end of the train.
And I know today's people's concept of travel is different, of course, but you would be conducting business, oftentimes meetings while you were en route on the train, either in a club car or perhaps a dining car or perhaps just a lounge, correct?
Yes, it worked that way because there were usually officers or officials of the railroad on any one train at any given time. And of course, the company was small enough in those days that you knew the people and they knew you, and there was a lot of business and learning connected with those trips and doing business with people on the train, yeah.
In addition to the KCS, your firm has also represented Southern Pacific. Well, it was a branch line, the St. Louis Southwestern Cotton Belt Railroad, for many, many years, correct?
Correct. The St. Louis Southwestern Railway, also called the Cotton Belt, came into Shreveport fairly early and built the first railroad bridge over the Red River. And they were acquired by the Southern Pacific Railroad in the early 1930s, and we did not represent the Southern Pacific at that time. But in 19 in 1970, the Southern Pacific went under a change out of sorts, and they came here, and anyway, they interviewed us, and we were then employed to represent the Southern Pacific as well as the Cotton Belt, who we had always represented. And part of that representation included the representation and taking care of accidents that the railroad might have, because the Southern Pacific did not want to incur the expense of putting a claim agent in Shreveport. And so we, in effect, did that work, investigated accidents, and one of the jobs of the young lawyers in this law firm, and I'm sure you got your share of that work, was investigating railroad accidents. And you and Jerry Jones and Bobby Gilliam, Mark Gilliam, have all done more than your share of that type of work.
And that would be a 24-hour call basis, 7 days a week?
It would be a 24-hour call, and they knew how to call you at home, and they knew how to call you while you were watching a Super Bowl game. I remember that.
Now, in addition to the railroad work, the firm has also represented the SWEPCO. I'll call it SWEPCO. It's the different corporate names now, but it was the power company, transmission and utility service to residents for a pretty wide region, correct?
Yes, we've been privileged to represent Southwestern Gas and Electric Company, which was the original name of AEP SWEPCO, since 1918, when it got its, what basically is its present corporate existence at that time, and have done so until the present, which has been a long and happy relationship.
Now, the firm has many clients that we can talk about, but there are a couple of cases I kind of wanted to visit about. And with the SWEPCO, I recall when I was clerking for Judge Stagg, they were still talking about the Nelms case. It's a published opinion. And there was a couple of, I think, very interesting developments in that case that I was going to ask you about.
Well, I remember it. Go ahead, fire away.
First of all, it was one of the earlier cases where there was alleged discrimination, disparate treatment in a class action setting against a corporate entity here in Shreveport in federal court, correct?
Yes, sir. It was broad-based on 8 different charges, I think, of alleged racial discrimination on the part of SWEPCO, the defendant, which was brought by a number of individual plaintiffs. And SWEPCO, after investigating the issues, denied any liability on any issues and made the decision to defend the case on all counts.
Right, and you defended SWEPCO in that matter.
That's where it came down. That's correct.
And it was through the class certification hearings and actually trial on the merits.
That's correct. And at some point in this litigation, which was going through all stages of discovery and class certification issues and so forth, I became aware that the pleadings that I was having to respond to that were being filed by the other side were very sophisticated. And almost
the other side were local plaintiff attorneys.
The local side were local attorneys who I was familiar with. And this was something really at a different level, almost Harvard Law Review type materials. And I didn't really understand or know what was going on, but after a while I learned that the EEOC was trying to intervene in the lawsuit, but they had not yet been allowed to intervene in the lawsuit, claiming it was a matter of, quote, national importance, close quote. And somehow I began to believe that the EEOC lawyers in D.C. and elsewhere were ghostwriting the pleadings that I was having to respond to. So what I did at this point was employ the fellow over in Monroe, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he has been around for almost as long as I have, who is a forensic document examiner.
Probably Bob Foley.
I believe that's correct. And shipped him these papers that were giving me problems. And he confirmed my suspicions that these were written on government letterhead, government papers, and had the government logo impressed on some of the papers. And that's what I was dealing with.
Now, did you bring that to the attention of the
So
court in
I
a
brought,
rather dramatic
I
fashion?
brought that to the attention of the court, and he held a special hearing on it. And I think you were there as a law clerk, and I remember my opening statement was to the effect that behind Judge Stagg's bench was a great seal of the United States, and it was also where it was supposed to be, and it was also found on another page, on another place in that courtroom where it was not supposed to be and had no legal right to be. That was on these papers being filed by the government. And they had sent 3 or 4 lawyers from D.C. and several from Atlanta for the EEOC to this hearing, which Judge Stagg had granted specially. And up to this time, remember, the EEOC had not been allowed to intervene in the lawsuit. And I was asking for sanctions, and I guess the sanction that I wanted the EEOC not to be allowed to intervene in the lawsuit because of this culpable, what I considered, misconduct. And Judge Stagg, he rendered a decision in which he struck 3 or 4 of the EEOC lawyers from Washington from ever participating in the case, and I've heard that he wrote letters of censure for their personal files. I don't know whether or not that's correct or not. But that was the that was the only penalty, and they were allowed to intervene in the lawsuit. And I guess looking back on it, because we did win the lawsuit on all counts, that was probably a plus to have the EEOC in the lasuit, where the the end result was
Ultimate
against
outcome.
them and favorable to us.
In
And
addition,
after it was over, believe it or not, the EEOC lawyers invited me to come to Washington, D.C. at their expense to speak to them on the subject of litigating against the EEOC. And that was an interesting challenge, and I broached it to my clients and said that the EEOC had offered to pay for this excursion, for this trip. And they said, if you would like it and you won't tell them any real secrets, have at it. And so that's what I did. It was quite an experience.
I also recall you were involved in a very, I think, hotly contested class certified alleged discrimination against Sears and Roebuck here in Shreveport, and Sears was also a client of this firm's. And that is another matter that, and again, this was in the early days when employment discrimination was pretty much what the federal docket was consisting of. You tried that one successfully to conclusion with a successful result.
That's right. Thank you for remembering. That was a happy experience, which went to the Fifth Circuit, and I well remember the thing about the case that I remember the most was that Sears only had in Shreveport 3 or 4 of the top management employees who were in a special category called, I believe they were just called non-exempt, 3 or 4 non-exempt people. And all of those people at that time obviously were white, and they were white males. And ultimately, during the time that the lawsuit was progressing, a minority was promoted to one of those positions. But while we were on appeal to the Fifth Circuit, and the Fifth Circuit had to write an opinion on the case, Judge Higginbottom at the Fifth Circuit at that time, who had a way with words, he referred to the Sears statistics as the inexorable zero in accomplishing getting any minorities into the non-exempt class here in Shreveport. It was still an inexorable zero. So the next time I was before Judge Higginbottom, I had the pleasure of telling the inexorable is now 1, and that's what I remember about that case. Yeah.
And SWEPCO and Sears, over the years, all the litigation is pretty much, I think, over with, and as you know, the workforces have now the parity that I think the statute, 1964 Civil Rights Act, was trying to accomplish in the country, and it did so through the system, correct?
I like to think so, yes.
I wanted to ask you one specific case that always had an interest to me, and there are two things. And I wrote an article about this. Judge Stagg would hold his group of law clerks over to the Petroleum Club at a noon Saturday get-together, and you were often a part of that.
Well, I probably was not a meeting with the law clerks. I was probably there playing gin rummy and having lunch. But I think that is true, that he often hosted his law clerks and out-of-town guests at the Petroleum Club on Saturday, because that was about the only place in downtown Shreveport where you could have lunch on Saturday. Everything else was closed.
And I seem to remember this. One time you received a telephone call either after hours or on the weekend, and it ended up being a very interesting First Amendment case that you tried.
You're talking about the movie censorship cases?
I am.
Yes.
If you could share that with us just a little bit.
Well, that came about in this way. It was in 1970 or thereabouts. And Judge Stagg was not yet a federal judge. He was commissioned in 1972 or 3. And he was moving or negotiating, whatever you do at this time, to become a federal judge. And I'm sure he did not need long-term controversial litigation on his plate at that time. And he received a telephone call from a Baton Rouge lawyer who had asked him to recommend someone in Shreveport to take on what we call the movie cases, which which he broached to me. He didn't know too much about it, and I didn't either. I knew nothing about it at that time, which he broached to me at a session at the Petroleum Club on a Saturday afternoon. And I told him I would be glad to think about it and would let him know. And so I attempted to find out more about the case. The Baton Rouge lawyer was Hop Brazil, who represented Teddy Solomon, who owned most of the movie houses in North Louisiana and New Orleans and Baton Rouge at that time. And what had happened, the Shreveport Police Department had padlocked the Broadmoor Theater, which was a nice neighborhood theater here in Shreveport, owned by the O.D. Harrison family, when it was showing a softcore skin flick called The Stewardesses. And the Broadmoor was padlocked when it had a sold-out audience in there.
On Line Avenue?
No, the Broadmoor was on Uri, just north of the First Baptist Church, of the Broadmoor Baptist Church. But anyway, it had been padlocked, and the audience dispersed, and it was returnable. It was padlocked on the basis of a temporary injunction issued by one of the local judges, state district judges, and it was returnable on the following Monday morning. Remember, this is a Saturday afternoon. It was returnable on the following Monday morning in the Caddo Parish District Court as to why this injunction should not be made permanent, which at any rate, the bottom line is I agreed to undertake attempting to represent the movie people on this basis, and did. What had happened, the Caddo Parish Police Jury, which today is the Caddo Parish Commission, determined that it was going to be the censor or the imperator of all the movies being shown in Shreveport, and whatever they considered obscene or offensive was going to be padlocked and shut down and enjoined. In addition to that, there were heavy sanctions about fines and imprisonment. that was going to happen, and it later did happen, believe it or not. It happened with The Stewardesses, which was the movie that Judge Stagg got me involved with, plus after that a movie with Burt Lancaster called Elmer Gantry, which was shown nationally, uneventfully all over the United States. And another one that you're probably familiar with Marlon Brando, called Last Tango in Paris. They both fell under the Caddo Parish Police Jury's censorship domain, and we represented and tried those cases as well.
And these went to the Supreme Court, didn't they? Some of these cases went to the
It all ended up in the United States Supreme Court, and they were all decided in our favor on the basis of a case called Miller versus California, which had already previously been decided, and essentially said that motion pictures were protected by the First Amendment, and that the police authorities here in Shreveport had violated the First Amendment and violated the concept of prior restraint. And what I thought is somewhat funny about that case, I told the client that I expected to lose it in the district court because just because of the facts and circumstances that we were dealing with in those cases. There were 7 members of the church in the neighborhood who testified that they all found the movie offensive. Not all of them had seen the movie, and none of the police jurors, with one exception, had ever seen the movie, that they found it offensive. And anyway, we did lose it in the Caddo Parish District Court. They would not allow me to bring Rex Reed, the movie critic for the New York Times, and Judith Crisp, the movie critic for the New York Magazine, to Shreveport, as I was trying to do, to be expert witnesses. They would not give me a 48-hour extension. So Monday morning I was there, and my only witnesses were young people from LSU here in Shreveport who had seen the movie and just thought it was funny and not offensive at all. And I ran out of witnesses at 5:30 that afternoon, asked for another extension, did not get it. And at 9:30 that night, the judge rendered an oral opinion making the temporary restraining order permanent. And so I had no other recourse but to go to the Court of Appeal. And to show you how wrong I can be, I wrote to my client and told him, of course, recommended an appeal, that the Court of Appeal, Second Circuit here in Shreveport, was composed, I believe, I worded it as middle-aged white males who probably never saw half a dozen movies a year, and would probably also be offended by this skin flick. Well, when the Court of Appeals wrote their opinion, a short time later, they ruled unanimously that the action of the Shreveport Police Department and the Caddo Parish Police Jury constituted prior restraint under the First Amendment and was unconstitutional. And it was an opinion written by Judge Hurd, in which I believe Judge Ayers and Judge Gladney all joined. There was no dissent and there was no concurring opinion. It was a very neat, strong, accurate opinion, which turned out in the end to be exactly what the United States Supreme Court held. But anyway, after we won in the Court of Appeal, to my surprise, the state, not to my surprise, took writs which were granted by the Louisiana Supreme Court, and we go to New Orleans to argue the case. And we argued the case, and I remember thinking that Judge Al Tate, who was then on the Louisiana Supreme Court, that fellow really understood what this case was all about, and that he was with us. It turned out that he was, but we lost 4-3 in the Louisiana Supreme Court, and the 3 judges who were with us were all younger guys: Tate, Barham, and I believe Dixon, who had all returned, who were young guys who had returned from World War II and had seen a little bit of the world. And they wrote really strong dissents in favor of my position and against the minority. So after that, we lost 4-3 anyway. After that, I get a telephone. We asked for a rehearing, and I got a telephone call from Mr. Moyes, the clerk of court, and he says, "Mr. Carmody, the Supreme Court wants to see the movie." And you have to remember that up to this time, no court had ever seen the movie, although the film was in the record, was part of the record, which was down there. I said, Mr. Moes, I can tell you those guys are not going to enjoy this movie, and I'd really they'd rather not. I said, what do you think I should do? He said, I think you should go along with them. So anyway, I talked to the client, and we agreed, and the movie was shown in New Orleans at the screening room of Gulf South Theaters, Teddy Solomon's operation, which was a very eventful day. And I was there, and Charles Lindsay was there, representing the Caddo Parish District Attorney's Office. Charles and I were, and I believe still are, very good friends, and we were sitting side by side. These were very comfortable blue leather chairs, blue leather swivel chairs in a small theater in the building, in the Gulf South building, there in New Orleans. And all of a sudden, Mr. Moes comes in through the door and announces, "Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay," and we all stood up. And here comes the Supreme Court, all 7 of them in their, I started to say in their robes, but 6 of them were in their robes, and last was Al Tate in a rumpled business suit, kind of out of breath as he always was, tagging along behind. And I always felt that Al, in his business suit, was trying to say something, and he was. What he was trying to say is, this matter should never have been here in the first place, and it's relatively simple, and I can dispose of it right now if I was allowed to. So anyway, we showed the movie, and we again lost 4-3. And I never will forget that sitting there watching the movie, and nothing that any reasonable person could ever say was offensive or obscene was shown, except one of the stewardesses one time bared her breast in the movie, okay? And when this happened, one of the Supreme Court justices who was sitting in front of us, who I could name but I'm not, he took his swivel chair and he swiveled it backwards away from the film and sat there folding his arms, looking at the wall. And Charles Lindsay said to me, he says, "Art, you better put that one down for
a note,
for against you." Yeah, and he was, and we lost 4-3. Now you can go back and read those opinions from what I call the 3 young judges who descended from the 4-man majority of the Supreme Court, which are at this point really rather strong and personal and bitter. And one of those dissenting judges even wrote that he believed that the older Supreme Court justices could remember in their youth walking down Bourbon Street in New Orleans and seeing things 1,000 times more offensive than these 3 movies up here in Shreveport, The Stewardesses, Elmer Gantry, and Les Tango in Paris. So anyway, we took writs to the United States Supreme Court. The writs were granted. So I thought, well, Art, this is going to be the first time you've made it to the Supreme Court. This is going to be quite an experience, and you have a good, strong case, and you ought to win it. But that did not happen. The Supreme Court did decide it in our favor in a per curiam opinion based on what I said earlier was Miller versus California. And I did not get the trip to Washington, although the client did prevail finally, and it turned out that the 3 young justices were correct in how this case should have been decided.
All from a Saturday afternoon phone call.
All from a Saturday afternoon at the Petroleum Club, yeah.
Tell me, I'm going to move in another direction. State court judges at the time? Give us
in 1952, when I was admitted, were Judge Jim Galloway, who was the senior judge and a model judge in my book, William Woods, and Judge O'Neill. I can't remember Judge O'Neill's first name, but he had been a floor leader in the Huey Long administration. And he was not from Shreveport. He was from a smaller town and moved here, and I think that Huey Long helped with his appointment. But he was certainly a straight shooter, and no one ever believed that he was a spokesman for the Long administration. So it was Galloway, Woods, and O'Neill. later they were joined by Pops Turner. And then after that came others, Middleton, Alexander. And you know, I've been talking here for a long time, but we've had in this law firm some really wonderful judges that have come out of this firm. That would include Pike Hall and Charles Petrus.
You know, in addition to, you've practiced law, I know, and seen several judges in federal and state, but you're into what, 50, how long have you now had your license to practice law in the state of Louisiana?
Well, however many years it is from 1952, which I believe is getting close to, what, 58 years, something like that.
And received, I know, a lot of honors. You're a member of the American College of Trial, the college, trial lawyers. You're a member of the local Inn of Court, a master, which you helped found that with Judge Henry Politz and myself about almost 23 years ago.
Right, you and Hank Politz and Bob Pugh really deserve the main credit for getting our Inns of Court founded, yeah.
And as most people recall, you did one of the first presentations, and they still remember you as Wigmore on evidence and the views of evidence. You've also, though, been instrumental with the beginning of the Red Mask, which is a nice 25-year tradition here in Shreveport. You were a founding member of that. So as well as your law firm and your legal practice, I remember you doing a lot of pro bono work for St. John's Jesuit Loyola College Prep, correct?
Yes, that was one of the more pleasant, rewarding experiences of my life, because in 1969, the Jesuit fathers who were running the old St. John's High School, which I had attended, and it was now called Jesuit High School, because it was Jesuit fathers who still owned and ran the school. They called a meeting of a number of Catholic men one evening out at the rectory there on Jordan Street, and the head Jesuit from New Orleans came up there, and I was privileged to be there. I think Denny Long was there and Henry Brenner, that I remember. And the head Jesuit from New Orleans came up, and he made a presentation to us in which he discussed the shortage of manpower within the Jesuit order and the financial problems of the school. And he told us that that the Jesuits had hired Columbia University's in New York's business school to make a study for them. And when he finally got to the point was that two of their high schools in the country, in the southern part of the United States, Jesuit High School in Shreveport being one of them, and El Paso High School in El Paso, Texas, the other one, would need to be closed for financial and manpower reasons. And that was bitter news to most of us. In a way, it was not surprising, but it was bitter. And some of us met later and said we needed to respond to this, and so we started trying to respond. And under the leadership of J. Robert Welch, who was president of SWEPCO at that time, and one of the leading Catholic citizens here in Shreveport, we indicated that we were going to try to salvage this thing on Jordan Street that they were proposing to close. And we had any number of meetings and proposals and counter-proposals and negotiations with them. But we finally were able to strike a deal in which a nonprofit lay board assumed the teaching and financial responsibilities of the whole school.
And it continues to today, doesn't it?
It continues until today, and I've been privileged to get some recognition for that, which I think had a lot to do with me receiving that award from Fordham that you mentioned earlier.
You have how many children?
8.
So in addition to your practice, your church, your civic responsibilities and duties, you've raised 8 children who are all doing very well. I know them all, and another great accomplishment in your life,
Well, thank
your
you.
children and your family. Mr. Carmody, that concludes our interview today. Thank you very much for your clear recollection and sharing those great stories and your personal story with us.
Okay, thank you, Larry. I've enjoyed it. Thank you, Mr. Cameraman.